Hello and welcome to the first instalment of The Banned Histories, a retrospective of Aliens comics. The purpose of The Banned Histories is to revisit and share thoughts on old Aliens comics. Dark Horse ones mainly, but we'll also get to the more recent Marvel ones at some point. The What If series with Burke notwithstanding, which I've already covered. To get something out of the way from the outset, I'm viewing the continuity of the comics in the time and context that they were written, i.e. prior to the release of Alien 3 and Resurrection, and then later in the wake of those films leading up to the AVP films and Ridley Scott's prequels. So, for the sake of argument, Hicks and Newt didn't die and continued their adventures in the book we're about to look at. Dark Horse did revise some of their comics in the aftermath of Alien 3 in order to make them fit the new continuity, but this was subsequently ignored by Alien Resurrection. Hicks became Wilkes, Newt became Billy, and they really didn't do much with Rip. Never mind. We won't get into a lengthy discussion trying to get them all to fit together into one cohesive whole because it's pointless. There's no way to make them fit without major rewrites. And Fox and Dark Horse tacitly admitted as much when a new and better planned use of the license was attempted in 2014. But in order to avoid constant nitpicking about how they don't fit, we're going to look at the comics as if, what if Alien 3 and Resurrection didn't happen? At least for the time being. Additionally, this is spoiler central. Many of these comics are now over 30 years old, but not everyone has read them, so turn off now if you want to read them firsthand. Okay, with that out the road, we can start to look at Aliens issues 1 to 6, later known as Book 1, or Outbreak, or Earth Hive when adapted into novel form. It originally ran from July 1988 to July 1989, with issue 1 starting with Newt locked up in a mental hospital an indeterminate amount of time after Aliens. It's never revealed in the text exactly how long. A current date indicating it's a year ending in 54, mentioned later, is obviously incorrect since Aliens took place in 2179. However, in one of the letter columns, we're told it's about 10 years later. But when discussing timeframes, the first inconsistency pops up. Newt talks about being 8 again in relation to the aliens, when she was in fact 6 years old in the script, which is backed up later on in the story. She's also classified as a minor at one point, then does something rather adult later on, though it's not exactly uncommon for a 16-year-old. Either way, bottom line is, we're 10 years later, and Newt is still suffering from post-traumatic stress, having horrible nightmares about what happened on LV-426. Corporal Hicks hasn't had the best time either. Still a Marine, he's isolated from other troops who are scared he's carrying some alien contagion or are just frightened of his acid-scarred face. He drinks too much, fights too much, but then gets a shot at revenge and possibly redemption. Turns out the Orbital Coast Guard encountered this derelict cargo ship in Earth's orbit, and while arranging for its destruction, they get attacked by this alien that was hiding on board. This is all transmitted to Earth before their ship is destroyed. The government gets copies of the ship's log and tracks it back to the alien homeworld. A company, Bionational, sadly not Weyland-Yutani, who were curiously absent throughout most of the comics, managed to somehow find the pilot pod that was ejected from the cargo ship. On board is the captain, one James Lakovsky, and his friend. And then throw into the mix a dude called Salvage, who runs a religious TV channel that worships the alien. Bit of a mystery in that we never really find out how Salvage came across the alien, let alone scored a hologram of it. But anyway, it seems like a complex plotline, but truth be told, it's portrayed in a fairly simple fashion. Enough time is devoted to each story thread to let it develop naturally. The first issue ends with Hicks visiting Newt in hospital to tell him that he's going to the alien homeworld, and she asks him to take her as well. She asks him about his acid-scarred face and if it was caused by the aliens, which opens up a rather big question. 10 years and he never visited her? Ripley's absence is a mystery, but Hicks is living in the same country, maybe even the same city, and left her to rot in a mental hospital. Moving right along. Issue 2 introduces us properly to Lakovsky and his bizarre dreams about his mother and the alien queen. We also meet Massey, a corporate sociopath hired by Bionational to disrupt the government mission to the homeworld. And speaking of that, Hicks is training Marines for the mission as well as butting heads with his stereotypically incompetent commanding officer, Stevens, who pushes Hicks around for no other reason than the fact that he can and is a bit of a Gorman substitute. After visiting Newt, Hicks hacks into the hospital network and finds out that she's about to be lobotomized in an effort to deal with her nightmares. It seems medicine has regressed somewhat and gotten a smidge more authoritarian. Following that miraculous piece of luck, Hicks breaks Newt out of the hospital and smuggles her onto his ship. As Hicks' ship, the Benedict, takes off, pursued by the Massey-commanded K-014, we find that civilians on Earth are starting to have nightmares about the aliens as well. Of course, Stevens is pissed about Newt being on board, but there's nothing he can do about it. More mysterious is the death of one of the Marines who stumbles across someone sending telemetry to the K-014. We'll come back to this later. Back on Earth, Lukovsky gives birth to an alien queen which immediately burrows straight into a bionational suit called Ostrow. On the Benedict, Newt is getting cosy with a Marine called Butler, much to Hicks' chagrin, though Hicks' interest seems more paternal rather than jealousy, mercifully. On Earth, Salvage and his alien worshippers blow their way into the bionational labs using a suicide bomber and offer themselves to the alien queen as hosts. Other followers take them to a hideout. By the end of issue 4, the government is aware of Bionational's nefarious plans as Massey commandeers the Benedict in orbit over the homeworld. But not before Newt and Butler consummate their relationship. And considering she's only 16, or maybe they wrote her as 18, what is the age of consent in space anyway? Massey kills Stevens, who was the traitor feeding info and responsible for killing the Marine earlier. And not a moment too soon, since he was an irritating cliche anyway. Plus it helps add to Massey being a complete prick. As if he wasn't already for killing his family after they accidentally saw a confidential report on the aliens, which is furthered again when he sends Hicks Marines down to the planet to be hosts for the aliens, which he can then take back to Earth. The unarmed Marines are forced into a huge hive, just like Giger's unused breast-shaped pyramid from Alien. Nice touch. Bit of a plot hole here though. How are Massey's guys going to get Hicks' guys out of the hive? The point becomes moot when Hicks' guys are roundly ignored by the alien eggs. Massey's guys get attacked by flying lizardy things and take shelter in the hive. Not terribly smart, but they're kinda short on options. Hicks' guys break out through a wall in the hive, still unmolested, and go back to their lander to get some guns. Back in orbit, Massey hasn't counted on Newt, who tries to free the captured Hicks. At a vital moment she freezes instead of shooting Massey, who takes advantage and is about to kill her when Hicks distracts him enough for Newt to duck behind a console. She finds some strength and shoots Massey in the shoulder. He taunts her until she cold-bloodedly blows his head off. Might seem a bit out of character, but it's such a satisfying end to a great bad guy one can overlook it. On the planet, the now armed Marines go back to rescue Massey's guys at the hive, while Hicks and Newt fly down to try and pick them up. The Marines' lander having been blown up remotely courtesy of Massey. Newt pleads with Butler not to go, but he says he must. What seems completely stupid all of a sudden makes perfect sense, as during the assault on the hive, Butler is torn in half by an alien, and revealing he's a goddamn robot. All the Marines are. Newt, not unexpectedly, freaks out first at the situation, then at Hicks for not telling her. Now before we go on, let's go back to the bit where Stevens killed an eavesdropping Marine earlier. Obviously, in order to not give the game away, they showed what can only be red blood in a black and white medium, thus creating a fair old continuity error. It certainly wasn't the white blood we see here. Anyway, 2 Marines and Butler make it back to Hicks' lander because no one uses dropships anymore. Before Hicks can arm a bunch of nukes, the aliens are all over them and start to tear their way into the ship. Instead of mounting a defence, Hicks tells them to save the ammo for themselves. At the last second, however, they're rescued by a space jockey with a ray gun. I remember my teenage jaw nearly hitting the floor when I first read this in the 1980s. Looking back now, I still think it stands up as a plot point if viewed through the context in which it was written, and at that point all we had was 2 films. I now prefer the idea that the jockey in Alien didn't have legs or needed a spacesuit and was really grown out of the chair as Dallas surmised. Turns out Prometheus proved me, and Dark Horse, wrong, and I like what Prometheus did with them too. But in terms of using something existing in order to drive the story, in the absence of Ripley, pulse rifles, dropships, Weyland-Yutani, etc., not too bad at all. The final issue of the series is entirely tying up loose ends. Newt has a flashback to her parents and the derelict on LV-426. It would seem Dark Horse didn't have access to deleted footage or stills from Aliens at this point. The jockey telepathically has a flashback it beams into Newt's head, showing the jockey from Alien being hugged and crashing on LV-426. Apparently that jockey was this new jockey's friend and was supposed to carry the eggs away into deep space. The new jockey is apparently hell-bent on revenge. Hicks and Newt watch a report from Earth from Arona, the guy who sent Hicks on this mission in the first place. Earth has been taken over by the aliens and the military are evacuating. Arona has timed a bunch of nukes to go off after they've left. There's some interesting insights into how such a takeover would take place. For instance, the alien can adjust its gestation period seemingly at will in order to spread and infest another area, and many people are shown having an alien pop out of them while travelling. There's also some ham-fisted attempts at profundity, with society shown to be in decline and chaos. Despite not really much of a hint of this in the previous 5 issues, quite the opposite in fact. We're often shown that everything seems pretty normal. The aliens are portrayed as a cleansing force, with a rather hackneyed, "the aliens didn't destroy us, we did." But even that said, Arona's final sign-off as the aliens break into his office and he holds a gun to his head saying, "I've never actually fired one of these before. I feel rather foolish," packs real poignancy. Newt argues with Hicks that they have to go back to Earth. Hicks says that they're helpless. Newt points out that the jockey isn't. They get back to Earth to find it almost completely overrun. They land while the jockey ship moves into orbit. They try to convince the powers that be to let the jockey stop the aliens, but eventually realise the military doesn't want to stop the aliens. They want the aliens to kill everyone. Then Arona's bombs will kill the aliens, and then they can come back and remake the world the way they want it. Newt, Hicks and half a butler stow away in an automated cargo carrier called the American, the 2 other nameless Marines having been conveniently disposed of for parts. As they leave Earth, the jockey beams its plan to Newt. It's not going to kill the aliens. It knows about the nukes. It knows about the military's plan to return and re-terraform Earth, and it's going to be waiting. But doesn't matter because she has a totes hot and sensitive boyfriend now. Half a boyfriend. She spent her entire 16 years in a shitty colony and an asylum. Of course she's going to have issues. Give her a break. And thus ends Aliens Book 1, written by Mark Verheiden, who managed to get a character named after him 16 years later in AVP. Considering he didn't write any AVP stuff, and depending on your opinion of said film, it's either flattering or a bit insulting. The artwork was by Mark Nelson, who created some awesome moods and tones. Reissues of this series were inked in colour, which was a bit of a travesty. Nelson also did colour covers, which were pretty great, but the interior blacks, whites and greys used here are perfect. Most of the character likenesses for Hicks and Newt aren't overly accurate. Newt was 10 years older, so that's perfectly forgivable. But nonetheless, they are consistent throughout. The ships aren't really reminiscent of anything we've seen in the films, except the K-014, which owes more than a little to the Sulaco. The rest is serviceable without being anything spectacular design-wise, though they are again well drawn. The Benedict is a bit too streamlined and curved though, and looks a little out of place. I've mentioned some inconsistencies in the writing earlier, but overall it hangs together pretty well. Reader feedback at the time was almost universally positive. Dark Horse, to their credit, did print some dissenting voices in the letter columns, but often it was the voices of idiots who complained about a dream Hicks has that retells a segment of Aliens that shows Hudson covering him and Frost as they try to help Vasquez and Drake, who were pinned down by the aliens. Hicks arrives to find them both chest-bursted. Of course it never happened like that in the film, which the writer snottily moans about, of course being completely oblivious to the fact Ripley dreamed of something that never happened in that very film. Maybe Dark Horse did receive some actual intelligent criticism. If they did, they just stuck to the negative stuff that was easily dismissed. I don't really give things scores out of 5 or 10, but viewed as an alternate continuation of Aliens, I highly recommend this series. It holds a special place for the teenage me, and despite the aforementioned criticisms, it really holds up for the old me too.